There comes a point when certain fictional villains stop feeling fictional. Maybe it happens when you realize you understand why a character made a terrible decision. Or maybe it's when a villain starts feeling less like a monster and more like a person who slowly lost control of something inside themselves. And honestly, I think that realization makes people uncomfortable sometimes. Because once you stop looking at villains as pure evil, you start noticing the very human emotions underneath them: insecurity, loneliness, resentment, obsession, fear, the need to matter. The archive gets a lot of strange files, but some of the strangest are the ones where people recognize themselves a little too easily. Welcome to the Dark Archive Bureau, sometimes simply called the Archive. I'm Fulcrum, and in today's side quest, I want to talk about why fictional villains connect with us psychologically in the first place. Because I don't think people are fascinated by villains simply because they like evil characters. I think people are fascinated because good villains reveal real emotional patterns.
This is a Fulcrum Side Quest mini-sode. Short, focused opinions on psychology and storytelling, personal reflections, unscripted thoughts, maybe even some of your suggestions. Here's Fulcrum.
Welcome to Side Quests, a mini-sode series from Dark Character Profiler. These are the detours, the hidden trails off the main path, where we explore the overlooked, the unexpected, and real-world psychological echoes. Let's get into today's side quest. Fiction as a safe psychological space. Fiction gives people something reality usually doesn't: distance. In real life, traits like manipulation, narcissism, obsession, emotional instability, or the need for control can be genuinely destructive. These behaviors hurt people, sometimes badly, but fiction creates a kind of psychological buffer. It gives us a safe place to examine uncomfortable emotions and behaviors without directly experiencing the consequences ourselves. Stories become emotional simulations, a way to ask difficult questions from a safe distance. Questions like, what happens when someone builds their identity entirely through power? What does isolation do to a person over time? How does humiliation slowly turn into resentment? What happens when someone becomes psychologically trapped inside a need for validation? Those are real psychological questions. Fiction just wraps them in lightsabers, superpowers, crime empires, and dramatic music. And honestly, that's probably part of why villain analysis has exploded online over the past several years. People aren't just asking, is this character evil? They're asking, why do they behave this way? Why does Homelander need constant approval despite having overwhelming power? Why does Walter White keep escalating long after he already has enough money? Why does Darth Maul stay emotionally trapped in revenge even after the original conflict is basically over? Those are psychological questions, which means people aren't just connecting to the spectacle, they're connecting to the emotional logic underneath it. Fictional psychology versus real psychology. Now, obviously, fictional characters are not one-to-one representations of real psychological conditions. Writers exaggerate traits constantly. Stories simplify things. Characters become symbolic. A villain might represent rage, or pride, or fear, or narcissism. But real people are usually much messier than fictional archetypes are. And honestly, this distinction matters a lot, because understanding behavior is not the same thing as excusing behavior. Psychological explanation is not moral approval. Having narcissistic traits does not automatically make someone dangerous. Trauma does not automatically create violence. Mental illness does not automatically create cruelty. Real psychology is significantly more complicated than fiction often makes it appear. But even with those limitations, fictional stories reveal emotionally truthful patterns. Because no matter how fantastical a story becomes, characters still need believable emotional motivations to feel real. Even in fantasy, human behavior still matters. And I think people intuitively recognize that. Why villains feel human? Most people don't relate to villains because they want to commit crimes or take over galaxies. They relate because they recognize the emotional structure underneath the behavior: fear of rejection, the need for control, shame, anger, jealousy, the desire to feel important. Those emotions are human. The actions may be extreme, but the emotional roots are often recognizable. And honestly, the most memorable villains are usually the ones that force us to recognize something uncomfortable about ourselves. Not because we secretly admire them, but because we understand parts of them. That's why some fictional villains stay culturally relevant for decades while others disappear almost immediately. The memorable ones usually reflect emotional conflicts people experience in everyday life: identity, powerlessness, isolation, validation, obsession, grief. Stories act like emotional mirrors. Sometimes they reflect things people don't know how to describe directly. Someone may struggle to explain their resentment or loneliness in real life, but recognize it instantly in a fictional character. And I think there's genuine psychological value in that recognition. Why analyze fictional characters at all? One of the biggest misunderstandings about villain analysis is the assumption that analyzing a character means glorifying them. For me, it's honestly the opposite. The goal isn't admiration, it's understanding. Understanding how identity can collapse under pressure. Understanding how obsession distorts judgment. Understanding how fear sometimes disguises itself as control, arrogance, or aggression. Fiction gives people an accessible way to engage with complicated psychological ideas. Because, let's be honest, most people are not going to sit down and casually read forensic psychology research papers for fun, but they will watch a story about Walter White, or Homelander, or Darth Maul. Stories create emotional investment first, then curiosity follows afterward. And honestly, I think that matters, because psychology becomes much easier to understand once people emotionally connect to the behavior being discussed. Final thoughts. Maybe that's why fictional villains linger in people's minds long after the story ends. Not because they're monsters, but because underneath the fiction, they still reflect recognizable human emotions. The fear of being irrelevant, the need to matter, the temptation to seek control when life feels unstable, the inability to let go of resentment, the desire to feel seen. Those things are deeply human. Fiction just exaggerates them enough for us to finally notice. And honestly, I think that's why these stories matter psychologically. Because sometimes fiction gives people language for emotions they didn't fully understand until they saw them reflected somewhere else, even if that reflection came from a villain. This side quest is complete. I'm Fulcrum. Stay curious.
That's it for today's side quest. If you have any topic suggestions, send us an email at darkcharacterprofiler@gmail.com. Don't forget, Dark Character Profiler returns next week. Thank you for listening.